Hello, everyone, and welcome to this explainer. I am so glad you're joining us today. If you're the kind of focus learner who loves taking these sweeping, incredibly complex geopolitical histories and breaking them down into clear, understandable pieces, well, you are in the exact right place. Today, we are unpacking the history of the Solomon Islands, and we are talking about a massive 47,000-year history here. We aren't just rattling off dates, though. We're going to explore exactly how the deep, diverse history of this Pacific archipelago directly shaped the really complex modern landscape it's navigating today. It's literally a place where geography, colonialism, global war, and modern economics all collide. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for today. 1. An archipelago of diversity. 2. Empire and world war. 3. Independence and the tensions. 4. The logging economy. 5. Climate change and conservation. And 6. Forging a new future. Basically, we'll be tracing a direct cause and effect journey from deep history right up to their modern-day challenges. Section 1. An archipelago of diversity. To truly grasp the story of this nation, we first have to understand its staggering geographical and cultural baseline. 992. That is the sheer number of islands and atolls making up this nation, scattered across roughly 1.3 million square kilometers of the southwestern Pacific Ocean. Just think about that for a second. You can instantly see the immense logistical challenge here, right? Imagine trying to build roads, deliver healthcare, or even just forge a unified national identity across nearly 1,000 mountainous islands and low-lying coral atolls spread over this vast expanse of water. It is a monumental task for any government. And it's not just the geography that's fragmented, it's the culture too. Across those 992 islands, there are 74 different languages and dialects spoken. And I don't mean just different accents, we're talking distinct languages. For millennia, this really deep-rooted cultural fragmentation has defined their society. You've got people of Melanesian and Polynesian descent living in societies organized around distinct clans and local customs. Historically speaking, there was absolutely no single Solomon Island identity. It was really dozens of fiercely independent groups. Let's move along and see how this builds. Looking at the massive span of human migration, people related to Papuan ancestors arrived an incredible 47,000 years ago. Then you have the seafaring Lapita people showing up about 3,500 years ago. These groups mixed, they traded, and they established really deep, self-sufficient societies long before the concept of a nation-state ever even existed. It actually wasn't until 1568 that European explorers arrived, which eventually led to the British establishing a protectorate in 1893. That massive gap in time before European contact is absolutely crucial to keep in mind. Section 2. Empire and World War. This is the era where external disruptors completely transformed the traditional way of life. Now, what's really interesting here is the name itself. The Solomon Islands were named in 1568 by the Spanish explorer Álvaro de Montaña. And why? Because he mistakenly believed these islands held the fabulous utopian gold riches of the biblical king Solomon. Literally, he was out there searching for the kind of wealth the Spanish were pulling out of Peru, and he just mapped this European myth directly onto a Pacific archipelago. But the true structural shift? That happened in 1893, when Great Britain established a protectorate over the islands. The British basically just drew arbitrary lines on a map. They pulled all those fiercely independent, culturally distinct groups, who, remember, spoke 74 different languages, into a single administrative unit. They completely ignored traditional boundaries. And this colonial decision sowed the absolute seeds for future instability, laying down a foundation that forced different ethnic groups to suddenly compete within a Western-style centralized government framework. Then came the violent shockwave of World War II. In 1942, the Japanese invaded. Almost overnight, these relatively isolated colonial outposts were transformed into globally strategic military bases. The island of Guadalcanal became the site of massive, incredibly bloody naval and land battles before finally being recaptured by Allied forces in 1943. The Allies built up massive infrastructure for their war effort, basically transforming places like Honiara into a major military base and altering the physical and social landscape forever. Which leads us to a critical narrative hinge. What happens when a new nation inherits those arbitrary colonial borders, a centralized capital built by foreign militaries, and an incredibly diverse population? What actually happens when those external colonial and military forces finally pack up and leave? Section 3. Independence and the tensions. This brings us right to the breaking point of their modern history. In 1978, the nation gained peaceful independence from Britain. But, unfortunately, that peace would gradually erode, building up to a devastating domestic crisis locally known as the tensions. By the late 1990s, the country was fracturing, primarily centered on the island of Guadalcanal, where the capital, Honiara, is located. We see two main factions emerge here. On one side, indigenous Guadalcanal islanders felt deeply marginalized. They were driven by intense land grievances and felt they were losing control of their own cultural and economic resources. On the other side, you had settlers from the neighboring highly populated island of Malaita. They had migrated to Guadalcanal out of economic necessity, seeking jobs and land in the capital's expanding economy. So you have two groups, both with deeply rooted historical and economic motives, clashing violently within the confines of a struggling state. And this clash escalated incredibly fast. By early 2000, law and order had completely broken down in Honiara. The National Police Force basically fractured, with many officers actually deserting their posts to join the armed militias. You had widespread violence, property destruction, and what was essentially a de facto coup. Thousands of people, largely Malaitans, living on Guadalcanal were forced to flee. It created this massive wave of internally displaced people. The state was, for all intents and purposes, failing. Section 4. The logging economy. Now, to understand why the state was so fragile to begin with, we really have to look at the modern crucible, resource extraction. And the numbers brilliantly illustrate that exact problem. Look at this rapid decline. In 1997, logging revenues accounted for an astounding 72% of the nation's GDP. 72%. It was the absolute lifeblood of the government. But, you can't harvest forests at that rate forever. By 2002, as timber stocks depleted and the country dealt with civil unrest, it dropped to 42%. And by 2006, down to just 19%. It shows the shocking fragility of a government whose economic foundation was built almost entirely on the unsustainable export of round logs. When an economy collapses like that, the real-world impact is just devastating. The government simply lost the ability to provide basic services. Health services went unfunded, schools across the islands were forced to close, infrastructure investment completely stalled out. And what happens when a government can't provide for its people? It deepens rural grievances. People in the provinces feel ignored and angry, which just loops right back around into fueling the exact kind of ethnic and regional unrest we saw during the tensions. Section 5. Climate change and conservation. As if rebuilding a fractured society and a depleted economy wasn't enough, we have to introduce the looming existential threat that compounds everything. Global climate change is fundamentally altering the reality for the Solomon Islands. We're talking about a population that heavily relies on the land and sea for subsistence. Fishing, coastal farming, you name it. Rising sea levels are literally eroding the very coastlines people live on. Warming oceans threaten the coral reefs and the fish populations they depend on. And extreme weather patterns are making agricultural yields wildly unpredictable. To vividly demonstrate just how extremely vulnerable these low-lying coastal areas are, we can look at the tragic events of 2006. A 7.1 magnitude earthquake struck the western Solomon Islands, triggering a massive tsunami, with waves reaching up to 13 meters high. Over 50 people lost their lives, thousands were instantly displaced, and vital infrastructure, things like hospitals, schools, national roads, was just completely destroyed. It is a really stark reminder of the environmental precarity these islands face every single day. Section 6. Forging a New Future. So, facing all of this, internal conflict, economic collapse, environmental disaster, how did they respond? Let's look at stabilization. In 2003, acknowledging that the local police just couldn't control the civil war, the government invited an international force. This was the Australian-led Regional Assistance Mission to Solomon Islands, or RAMSI. Their strategy was step-by-step. First, immediately disarm the rival militias to stop the violence. Second, restore basic law and order on the streets of Honiara. And third, begin the incredibly long, arduous process of rebuilding the national institutions that had entirely collapsed. So the crucial point is this. RAMSI worked in stabilizing the immediate crisis. They stayed for 14 years, restoring peace and essentially returning a functioning state to the people. In January 2017, the mission officially departed, handing full sovereignty back to the Solomon Islands. But while international forces definitely stopped the violence, they couldn't permanently fix the underlying systemic issues. The Solomon Islands now has to independently navigate its own incredibly complex future. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly tough question. How does a nation balance the urgent need for economic development with the existential threat of climate change? How do you unify 992 islands and 74 languages into a single cohesive identity, especially without relying on unsustainable logging to fund the government? It's going to require immense resilience for the Solomon Islands to forge this new path in the face of ongoing global pressures. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this fascinating history today. Keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.